And Lamar, just to recap the Southern strategy and how, what the Southern strategy was that Nixon rolled out in '68 in the election of '68, and how that Southern strategy has been used by Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump.
Sure. So the Southern strategy, created by Nixon and George and Bo Calloway, the failed candidate for governor, was designed to keep the racist vote in a way that did not alienate moderate and professional voters, especially voters in the North. So basically, you would use terms like being against busing, which they would always call forced busing, being the law and order candidate, to bring law and order to, the country that's being threatened by these lawless elements. And you would be basically make it pretty clear you were against fair housing laws. In other words, civil rights, for black Americans, any minorities, were not at the top of your list, but you would not use the N-word. You would not openly campaign that way. So Nixon, like I say, got elected in a squeaker in '68, overwhelmingly reelected, 6 months after Watergate in '72. Did have that problem when he got impeached, as we may see someone get impeached again in the next couple of years. But there was a political advisor by the name of Paul Manafort. And I'm sure if I had $1 for every time you've mentioned Paul Manafort's name in the last year, I'd be rich. So Paul Manafort began his campaign life working for Gerald Ford, which was not successful, but Ford would not really use the Southern strategy. So Ronald Reagan learned from that, hired Paul Manafort, and so Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign manager, was the Southern coordinator for Reagan's 1980 campaign. And so right after Reagan got the nomination, Manafort arranged for Reagan to speak at an event I'm sure you've talked about before, at a county fair down in Mississippi, just a few miles from where those three civil rights workers, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, were murdered back in 1964, with nobody really paying the price for that. And so did Reagan go down there and crusade that we've got to bring the killers of those civil rights workers to justice? No. He did exactly the opposite. Reagan gave a speech at this Mississippi County Fair where he embraced the term states' rights. Now, states' rights was the term that Southern states had used for decades to justify their discrimination against minorities and to justify their Jim Crow laws, some of which were still in effect at that era. So basically, Manafort used Nixon's Southern strategy to help elect Ronald Reagan, in 1980, and then of course he was reelected, and then Manafort kept doing it. Manafort hired a guy with a name familiar to some of your listeners, and I'm sure familiar to you, named Lee Atwater, joined Paul Manafort's firm. And Lee Atwater then helped to elect George H.W. Bush using the racist Willie Horton attack ads. And so, and Lee Atwater really summarized the Southern strategy really well. He said, in the 50s you could yell "N-word, N-word, N-word" if you were a Southern candidate, but by '68 you had to be much more careful about that and use the terms like law and order, protecting our neighborhoods, and then they just kept getting more refined. But again, when you go back and look at those Willie Horton attack ads that got Bush elected, I mean, they're just blatantly racist, and you can thank Paul Manafort for that. So now we have, eventually, Paul Manafort becomes Trump's campaign manager. And when that happens, people have analyzed that Trump started using more subtle racist appeals straight from the Southern strategy that Paul Manafort had been using since 1980. Like Trump is saying, I'm going to protect America from threats to, quote, our way of life, unquote. Well, he's meaning the white way of life. Trump starts exploiting the fears of crime. Trump just comes right out, takes the old Nixon Southern strategy label and says, I am the law and order candidate. All these other people who were supported by minority candidates, they can't be for law and order, of course, because the implicit message is that only minorities break the law, which of course is not true in Trump's case. That's really not true. And get this, Paul Manafort even had Donald Trump Jr. go to the same Mississippi County Fair as Reagan did back in 1980. And the result of Manafort and Trump using that Southern strategy is that Southern states provided more than half of Trump's electoral votes, according to a great article on the Facing South website. And Trump won white voters. It almost makes me ashamed to be white. Trump won white voters by 21% in every voting age group. I mean, if that's not a racist election victory, I don't know what it is. And then you've got Trump supported the Charlottesville races, his public support by David Duke, the way he does all like that. So again, now we're going to come back to Martin Luther King. And when we see how today is so much like 68 and that Southern strategy, and we're going to explain exactly why and how King was killed back in 68 because of the same divisiveness racially that we see today.